The final moments of stoppage time were ticking away. On the sideline, Marcelo Bielsa sat motionless on his water cooler. One of the most respected minds in football. A coach who has guided generations of elite players. And in front of him was something almost nobody saw coming. Cape Verde were taking points from Uruguay. A nation of just over 500,000 people. A team making its first ever World Cup appearance. Pushing a two-time world champion into serious danger. This was not a random moment, not a one-off shock, because just days earlier, Cape Verde had also held Spain to a draw. Suddenly, teams once viewed as guests at the 2026 World Cup were becoming the main story. And that is what makes this so fascinating. The 2026 World Cup was built to be FIFA's biggest tournament ever. But as the competition unfolds, it is raising a question FIFA may never have expected. Are football's smallest nations beginning to reshape the balance of power in the global game? To understand why stories like Cape Verde are making headlines, we need to look at FIFA's biggest decision in decades. The 2026 World Cup is the first World Cup ever to feature 48 national teams. Instead of 64 matches, the tournament has expanded to 104. More teams, more host cities, more tickets, more broadcasting rights, and of course, more revenue. FIFA presented the change as a major step toward making football truly global. More nations would have the chance to reach the biggest stage in the sport. More fans would get to see their countries compete at a World Cup. That was the official message. But behind it was a simpler reality. A bigger tournament is also a more valuable commercial product. And throughout the build-up to the 2026 World Cup, one question dominated the debate. Would the 48-team format actually work? What is happening on the pitch may already be providing the answer. At first glance, these look like a few exciting upsets. Cape Verde take points from Spain. Cape Verde take points from Uruguay. Curaçao hold Ecuador to a draw. But a closer look reveals something much bigger. Because this is no longer the story of a single match. It is the story of an entire system. The 2026 World Cup was designed to create more opportunities. And suddenly, teams once dismissed as outsiders are taking advantage of those opportunities far better than anyone expected. So what is really driving this wave of underdogs? Is it simply luck? Or has FIFA unintentionally created a tournament where the gap between football's giants and its smaller nations is shrinking faster than ever before? FIFA explained the World Cup expansion with a very simple message. More nations. More opportunities. More fans. It sounded completely reasonable, but that was not the whole story. Every additional team meant more matches. More matches meant more tickets. More broadcast hours, more sponsors, and more revenue. That is why the tournament expanded from 64 matches to 104. This was not just a football decision. It was also a business decision. The issue is that FIFA did not simply want more teams. FIFA wanted more value. They wanted the biggest markets to stay in the tournament longer. Teams like Brazil, Argentina, England, France, Germany, and Spain. Because when those teams make deep runs, global audiences grow, and so does revenue. That is the natural logic of a tournament worth billions of dollars. On paper, the plan looked almost perfect. There was just one problem. The smaller nations did not come here to play supporting roles for anyone. When FIFA expanded the World Cup to 48 teams, they knew more nations would be making their first appearance. That was part of the plan. New stories are always compelling. Emotional moments always attract attention. But there was an unspoken assumption behind it all. The smaller teams would arrive, inspire people, and then go home. While the traditional powers continued their march through the tournament, that was the perfect scenario. Fans would get their fairy tale stories in the group stage. Broadcasters would still get the biggest matchups in the knockout rounds. Everything would unfold exactly as planned. But football rarely follows the script. Cape Verde did not come here to take souvenir photos. They did not come here to swap jerseys with superstars. They came to compete. They held Spain to a draw. They took points from Uruguay. And suddenly, teams once viewed as guests were reshaping entire groups. That was the moment the original plan began to crack. Because FIFA wanted more teams. But what FIFA really wanted was more big teams. And those are two very different things. At first, many believed Cape Verde had simply produced a surprise result. A draw against Spain. Then everything would return to normal. But it did not. They followed it up by taking points from Uruguay, one of the most historic teams in World Cup history. That was no longer luck. It was becoming a pattern. In another group, Curaçao responded to a heavy defeat against Germany by standing firm against Ecuador. They did not win, but they did not disappear. And that is what matters most. Because in the new format, you do not need to win your group. You do not need to win every match. You simply need to survive long enough. Every point matters. Every draw can reshape an entire group. Suddenly, the smaller nations are no longer playing supporting roles. They are taking points that the giants once assumed were theirs. And when that happens, the pressure immediately shifts. It is no longer on Cape Verde. It is no longer on Curaçao. It is on Uruguay. It is on Ecuador. It is on the teams expected to advance. FIFA expanded the World Cup to create more opportunities. But those opportunities are being used in ways very few people ever expected. When people look at teams like Cape Verde or Curaçao, they usually see the gap in talent. But that is not the whole story. These smaller nations possess a very different kind of advantage. They have almost nothing to lose. Nobody expects Cape Verde to reach the quarterfinals. Nobody expects Curaçao to beat stronger opponents. Every point they earn is a success. Every draw feels like a victory. That creates freedom, a kind of freedom the giants simply do not have. Meanwhile, the world's biggest teams enter the tournament carrying enormous pressure. A draw is treated like a failure. A defeat can become a national crisis. Every decision is scrutinized. Every mistake is magnified. And sometimes that pressure makes elite teams play with a heavier mindset than the opponents they are expected to beat. Cape Verde are not defending a reputation. Uruguay are. That is a gap no FIFA ranking can measure. Yet it becomes impossible to ignore once the match begins. At the World Cup, the biggest teams do not just bring players. They bring an entire ecosystem. Millions of fans. Hundreds of journalists. Sponsors, analysts, and enormous expectations. Every match is watched by tens of millions of people. Every decision becomes a headline. Every mistake is dissected for days. That is a level of pressure smaller nations rarely face. When Cape Verde draw with Spain, the world celebrates Cape Verde. When Spain draw with Cape Verde, the world questions Spain. That is the difference. One side is allowed to surprise. The other is expected to win. And with the World Cup expanded to 48 teams, these kinds of matches are becoming more common. More opportunities for the underdogs. More risk for the giants. Suddenly, football's traditional powers are no longer fighting only their opponents. They are also battling the weight of their own expectations. And that is where the new format begins to shift the balance of power across the tournament. In previous World Cups, a single mistake could send a smaller nation home. The margin for error was almost non-existent. But the 2026 World Cup changed that. It is no longer just the top 2 teams from each group that advance. The 8 best third-place teams also reach the knockout stage. It sounds like a small adjustment, but its impact is enormous. Because now, a draw is no longer just a point. It can become a pathway to survival. A clean sheet. A point against a stronger opponent. An unexpected victory. Sometimes, that is all it takes. That is why Cape Verde do not need to beat Spain. They simply need to avoid defeat. That is why Curaçao still have hope despite suffering a heavy loss to Germany. The new format rewards patience. It rewards discipline. And it rewards teams that know how to seize their opportunities. FIFA opened more doors to make the World Cup bigger. But those same doors are helping smaller nations stay alive longer than ever before. And that is where another question begins to emerge. Is this actually good for FIFA? From a football perspective, what is happening is fantastic. FOM love surprises. They love stories like Cape Verde. They love watching underdogs challenge the giants. That is what makes the World Cup special. But from a business perspective, the story is very different. Broadcasters pay billions of dollars for World Cup rights. Sponsors invest billions more to be associated with the biggest teams on the planet. They want blockbuster matches, global superstars, and major markets. That is the reality of modern football. And that is where a fascinating contradiction begins to emerge. The thing that excites fans the most is not always the thing that creates the most commercial value. Cape Verde taking points from Uruguay is a great story. But Uruguay crashing out early is a very different story. That is why the 2026 World Cup is raising a fascinating question. FIFA expanded the tournament to give more nations a chance. But if those opportunities truly begin to reshape football's established order, will FIFA be ready to accept the consequences? This may be the most important question in the entire story. Who does the World Cup really exist for? The football superpowers? Or every nation that belongs to FIFA? For decades, the biggest teams have dominated the tournament. They possess the best players, the strongest domestic leagues, and the largest global audiences. That is completely natural. But the World Cup was never meant to belong only to them. It was built on the idea that every nation has the right to dream, that any team can earn a place on the biggest stage in football. That is exactly why FIFA expanded the tournament. And now, the smaller nations are taking full advantage of that opportunity. Cape Verde have done nothing wrong. Curaçao have done nothing wrong either. They are simply playing by the rules FIFA created. So, if smaller teams advance while traditional powers are eliminated, that is not a failure of the system. It is the system working exactly as intended. And perhaps that is what makes the 2026 World Cup more fascinating than anyone ever imagined. In truth, the World Cup has always needed stories like Cape Verde. In 2014, Costa Rica found themselves in a group with Uruguay, Italy, and England. Most people expected them to be eliminated. Instead, Costa Rica finished at the top of the group. Italy and England went home early. In 2022, Morocco produced one of the most memorable runs in World Cup history. They defeated Spain, knocked out Portugal, and became the first African nation ever to reach a World Cup semifinal. Before them, there was Croatia, a country with only a few million people, yet one that repeatedly reached the latter stages of the tournament. Stories like these do not hurt the World Cup, they make it stronger. Because if every result were predictable, the World Cup would lose one of its greatest attractions. The belief that sometimes the impossible can still happen. The 2026 World Cup is not like the tournaments that came before it. Costa Rica in 2014 were an exception. Morocco in 2022 were an exception too. But this time, the story is not about just one team. It is happening across multiple groups. Cape Verde are causing problems. Curaçao are causing problems, and other smaller nations are proving they can compete as well. This is a direct consequence of the new format. More places in the tournament, more opportunities, more pathways to the knockout stage. Upsets are no longer rare accidents. They are becoming part of the tournament's structure. That is the biggest change. FIFA wanted a bigger World Cup, but they may have unintentionally created a more unpredictable one. And that is exactly what is making this tournament feel different from any World Cup that came before it. While the debate continues, one thing is becoming difficult to deny. The 2026 World Cup is giving a spotlight to nations that rarely receive one. Cape Verde are no longer an unfamiliar name. Neither are Curaçao. After just a few matches, they have captured the attention of millions of fans around the world. That is the unique power of the World Cup. A tournament where population size does not decide everything. where financial resources do not always win, and where smaller nations still have a chance to make history. Maybe FIFA never expected this, but they created the stage that made it possible. And for many neutral fans, that may become one of the most memorable stories of the entire tournament. When the 2026 World Cup comes to an end, people will remember the goals, the biggest matches, the biggest stars. But they may remember something else as well: the way smaller nations helped reshape the tournament. FIFA created the largest World Cup in history, the most teams, the most matches, and perhaps the highest revenue ever. But the true success of this tournament may not be measured by numbers. It may be measured by something far more important: whether the World Cup remains a place where every nation is allowed to dream. Cape Verde, Curaçao, and many others. They have shown that the gap between football's giants and the rest of the world is no longer as wide as it once seemed. And that may become the most enduring legacy of the 2026 World Cup. The 2026 World Cup still has a long way to go. The traditional powers may yet reassert themselves, but so far, some of the tournament's most memorable stories have come from the smaller nations. Cape Verde, Curaçao, and perhaps many more surprises still to come. So what do you think? Which underdog has impressed you the most at the 2026 World Cup? Let us know in the comments below. And do not forget to subscribe for more of the biggest, most fascinating, and most unexpected stories from the 2026 World Cup.